They stamped my boarding pass, and then the woman behind the counter said the words as if she were reading ingredient labels. No mothers. My daughter smiled the way one removes a stain from a tablecloth. Quick, efficient, utterly uncaring, and did not lift a hand to stop them. I suppose I should begin where everyone who tells a true story begins. Not at the end, and not even at the middle, but at the small things. The mason jar with pennies on my kitchen shelf. The chipped mug I'd kept since my first job at the bakery. The string of pearls that were not worth the money they once were, but kept the weight of my late husband's promise around my throat. These were the slow measures of my life, measured in heat of tea and the tick of a second-hand clock. They were, in the tidy ledger of my days, the income and the expense of a woman who loved without calculation. I had saved for a dozen small luxuries this life afforded me: a cab when my hip hurt, a new winter coat when the last had frayed, and last summer a cruise. I had told myself more than once that at 72 one is allowed a foolishness. I had saved with a stubbornness that surprised even me, until there was enough in that jar, about $200 in bills and coins, for my passage, the cabin with a small balcony, the dinners with candlelight where I could watch the sea open and be as small as a hand in a bowl. My daughter, Miranda, had been my pride and my undoing. There is no filial relationship more complicated than the one where love is mixed with gratitude and duty, where the heat of raising another human being blurs into expectation. I had fed her when she was feverish, sewed costumes for her kindergarten plays, and smoothed her hair the night she married because she asked me to. I had watched her enter the kind of life that men write operas about: mansions with columns, a name on a company door, a husband who kept 2 mobile phones and at least 3 lawyers. I did not begrudge her any of it, not at first. A mother's pride is a quiet currency, but pride is a poor shield against ambition. It does not halt the discreet arrangements made in the corners of parlors, or the quiet math of who is useful and who is not. On the morning of my intended voyage, April 3rd, 2 days before Miranda's gala to celebrate, the new wing at the museum, she called and asked if I would come to help with things. She said it in the tone of a woman who is arranging cutlery and assumes the cutlery will comply. I put on my second-best coat, tucked the mason jar under my arm like a sacrament, and went. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish and the quiet of wealth. Even the curtains had the same calm, suffocating hush that the rich develop to muffle the noises of the world. The portraits on the walls seemed to have been painted with a generosity only for certain angles, never the one from which I was looking. I brought my chipped mug tucked into a paper bag, because I thought foolishly she would want my tea at her side like the old days. When I presented the mug, Miranda's smile thinned. "Oh, Ma," she said, "we have a catering service." She took the jar from me as if it were an errant coin. "You went to all the trouble." Her fingers were cool. They did not notice the fingerprints of work. I should have taken that as the first small cut. Instead, I laughed, because how can one be bitter in one breath and still sip sugar from the same hand? I set the jar of coins on a marble-side table and went upstairs to fold linens the way she had once taught me to fold napkins for a school. Fair. You will understand by now how a life's value is not only in what is said, but in what is withheld. I thought the mason jar would be a joke, perhaps a story later, when we were older and the laughter had the weight of acceptance. But later did not come. 2 hours passed. I heard voices in the study, low, deliberate. I see now that every family, even those that fancy themselves above the mess, keeps a study like a shark keeps teeth, for the necessary tearing. I am not proud of the thing that made me listen. It was something as domestic as a ribbon falling. A bow from the opposite room had slipped as a worker carried a dress past my door, and the sound was like a clock striking. The voices stopped. I froze. I am old. My body remembers reflexes it learned in war and in kitchens. I tiptoed to the door and left it cracked. Miranda and her husband, Nicholas, sat like judges bent over a paper. The study smelled of old tobacco and varnish, luxury disguised as taste. There was an envelope on the desk, thick with folded documents, Miranda said, with a voice that made me think of knives wrapped in silk. If she comes here, we'll give her tea and then the attorney can handle it. Nicholas laughed, but it was a laugh that rusted the way dry wood will. The word attorney landed on me like a stone. I stepped back and the something behind me, my stomach, my pride, felt cold. I almost dropped my mug. I did not know what they meant. Not properly, not yet. But later that afternoon, after the hangers had been carried away and the house returned to its stillness, the envelope found its way onto my lap. A brief note, with my name but signed in a hand I did not recognize. "We are adjusting the estate," it said. "Please present all personal effects to the office for inventory." There was a form, Durable Power of Attorney, Revocation Notice, another paper labeled Inventory of Personal Property, and instructions in legalese that seemed built to close a door I could not open. I felt the blood leave my face. That evening, when I met with the attorney, Mr. Hargreaves, who kept his cufflinks like medals, his eyes slid over me like a ship's wake. "We will review the assets," he said, "including the master trust, approximately $230,000 allocated for personal funds, and the house maintenance fund. Decisions have been made." He mentioned dates in a manner so precise it sounded rehearsed. March 15th, 2025. March 20th, 2025. Those dates had the candor of knives. I asked one simple thing: was my name on any document? He tapped a ledger and then, more painfully than the ledger, he hesitated. "There have been amendments," he said. "We must review them." I went home with my mason jar under my arm and the cracked mug in my hand, and for the first time in my life I counted the pearls one by one. They were fewer than the last time I had checked. I thought perhaps age was thief enough. My hands trembled so much I almost dropped the chipped mug I'd carried for 30 years. I never expected what I found in that drawer. A locked box. Small, not as ornate as one might expect, but it had a nameplate. My nameplate. The key had been turned and the lock cold. I had kept letters in that box. Letters from my mother. A promissory note from a man long gone. The receipt for my first oven. A scrap of fabric from my daughter's first dress. The box was not supposed to be for strangers to open. I had tucked there, months before, a letter I had written. An old woman's ceremonial will of the things that mattered to me. The pearls to Miranda on condition she wore them. The mason jar to be used for a small holiday gift for the neighborhood children. The chipped mug to my neighbor who liked thrifted things. I had sealed that letter and signed it with a flourish, the way our family does when we mean a thing. The lock had been forced. The envelope was gone. I went to Miranda because there is always an odd cruelty in asking your child for the key to your dignity. She was on the phone laughing, the sound of glass breaking if glass could glitter. I cleared my throat and asked, as softly as one might ask for salt at a table, "Did you have someone look in my things?" Her eyes did something then that I will never unsee. She looked at me as if she saw a portrait of someone else. "Mother," she said, "we had to do inventories. You understand, insurances, allocations. We need to be tidy." Her mouth said tidy. Her hand said otherwise. Slick, closed, with a wedding band that looked like an anchor. I stood there with a silence that felt like a small, stubborn protest. Miranda flicked her wrist, and the corner of a nameplate on the side table glinted like a confession. It had my initials, faint as an old bruise. I asked for the key 3 days later. She sighed as if retrieving a key were a labor greater than childbirth. When she finally handed it to me, her fingers grazed mine for the briefest possible moment. An intimacy performed for a camera no one had placed. "There are other matters," she said. "The house will be under temporary management while we make some adjustments." It was a language practiced by the powerful to make the weak feel gratitude for being left with crumbs. I laughed then, because laughter is the only small rebellion left to an older woman who knows she may be made invisible. I laughed and I made tea. I had friends, of course I did. A neighbor, Mrs. Keene with her bread and her scold. A cousin who sent postcards with stamps of faraway birds. But wealth has a terrible way of shifting the orbit of people. Acquaintances become satellites around the new money. And old companions find themselves like pieces from a chess set, taken off the board for being inconvenient. Invitations fell away as if my name had turned pale, like a photograph left in the sun. I found, in small humiliations, a map of the place I had been reduced to. The friend who forgot to call on my birthday, the son of a neighbor who answered to his mother and then to an email from Miranda, the catering service that misplaced my order. The cruise I had saved for would have been the first real indulgence since my husband passed, and instead, it became a battleground where my money and their rules met, and, it seemed, my money lost. At the kitchen table, I set out the pearls and the empty envelope that had once contained my small will. I took the mason jar and I shook it slowly, listening to the tinkle of coins like rain on a tin roof. The sound steadied me. That night I lay awake, and the house was a machine with many gears, and I learned that the loudest grinding is never in the engine but in the quiet places where people whisper. I traced the edges of what I had lost and found that objects teach the hands how to remember. I thought of my mother and her hands, shaped by toil, and of the promises a family once made as if the future were a soft blanket. I began to watch, careful as a cat on a hot roof. I listened at doors. I read the posture behind the laughter. I let the hush of their rooms teach me what the loud rooms refused to tell. I heard the name of an attorney I had never met until then, someone who handled sensitive amendments at the law firm, A. Levingston. Escanas at a time, 3:15 p.m. on March 20th. It is a small cruelty of fate that details stick to the soul like burrs. I wrote down the dates and numbers on the inside of an old recipe book. On April 1st, I received a letter, thin and polite, that said only that arrangements were forthcoming and signed matter-of-factly with the firm's stamp. On April 2nd, a notice from the trust company arrived, indicating that temporary custodianship had been assigned to ensure maintenance and legal compliance. The words had the velvet of civility, but the teeth of eviction. I never told anyone that I had, in fact, boarded a bus to the cruise terminal the day I was told to stay home. I had the ticket, the receipt from the agency, cabin 214, balcony with sea view, booked March 1st, 2025. The stamp on my passport seemed to want to cry. I wanted more than anything to go to the sea and let its unhurried horizon teach me the scale of my troubles. At the terminal, with my jar and my mug and my pearls tucked into a worn purse, I was stopped by a security woman who wore a name tag with a smile that could have been a list. She took my pass and scanned it like someone reading a past they did not wish to recall. "Ma'am, we have a policy," she said. No mothers. I had stood in enough lines in bakeries and at post offices to know how to argue small injustices into larger ones. I opened my mouth to give her the story of a woman who had saved and who had the right to see the ocean. My daughter, I discovered, had already arranged the story into a legal paragraph. A call was made. A voice I recognized, Mr. Hargreaves, spoke into the receiver, and a phrase was used that made a paper-thin world collapse: temporary custodianship. My name became a clause, my life a footnote. I was asked to leave quietly, as if I were a coat from a closet that did not belong. I walked away from the terminal with the jar heavier and the pearls colder. In my heart there began then an arithmetic of grievances, the number of times I had been kind, the number of times kindness had become a license to erase. I felt small, and I felt, for the first time since my husband's funeral, something harder than grief, an ember of anger that burned with a clarity I had not known youth supplied. The house that once had been a library of my days had rearranged itself into shelves where my books had been moved out of sight. I do not pretend that revenge is an art for everyone. It is, however, a study, one that begins at the grammar of a slight and ends in the punctuation of consequence. I am not yet at the punctuation. I am at the page where the pen hovers. I wrapped the pearls in tissue paper and placed them back in their box. I poured the coins from the mason jar into my palm and watched them catch the light like small, indifferent stars. I made a list, because lists are a way of keeping promises to oneself. On it, retrieve the letter, discover the amendments, find A. Levingston-esque, understand what temporary custodianship entails, and beneath all the soft, daring intention to remind my family that mothers are not to be quarantined like invalid goods. The first item saved its quiet wound for another day. Dumas once wrote that injustice is a monster which, when nourished, becomes a tyrant. I felt the truth of that, as if I had held the monster's breath to my lips and found it warm. I opened the drawer and found the envelope I had thought taken. The envelope in my hand trembled like a small, frightened bird. I had thought it taken, eaten by the machinery of the house, but it sat there between my fingers, ordinary as a potato and laden with the same gravity. Inside, folded with the tenderness of someone who had once meant to be careful, was my letter, the one I had written in the evening light, the one that said, plainly, that the pearls belonged to Miranda if she wore them with respect, that the mason jar was for the children on my street, and that the chipped mug should go to Mrs. Keene because she liked things that bore the trace of living. Beneath it, tucked like a secret, was another paper I had not expected. A carbon copy of a document labeled, Last Will and Testament, Jane Roe, dated March 1st, 2025. Someone had made 2 copies. One had been hidden and one had been used like a blade. I sat down on the kitchen chair that had learned to carry my weight and read. The will named me as a beneficiary for the house's small annuity, $50,000 for maintenance and my personal funds of approximately $10,000. Nothing grand, but enough to pay for a winter coat and a warm kettle. It was simple, like a handwritten prayer. Yet above the signatures, in a hand that was not mine, someone had scrawled a later line, a codicil, dated March 20th, 2025, revoking the bequest and appointing a temporary custodian for administrative efficiency. The signature beneath that codicil was my name. I could see my life imitated on paper, a counterfeit of the nights I had curled into a shawl to mend socks. The letters had the arrogance of someone who believes the future is theirs to edit. I called Mrs. Keene, who brought over a loaf of bread and the kind of condolences that come in the shape of a casserole dish. She peered at the document as if it were an unreadable language. "You should show this to someone with a hat and a stern voice," she said. I laughed then, laugh that is not the same as the laugh I had at Miranda's house, and I told her to bring her hat if it helped. She did what neighbors have always done in our part of town. She baked, she kept watch, and she went to the library to photocopy things she felt a right to keep. From her, I learned the small mechanics of procedure. If someone signs a codicil, there will be witnesses. If the signature is forged, there will be a trail. If a law firm arranges temporary custodianship, there will be a paper trail long enough to hang a veil on it. I made a list as if planning a garden. Find the witness list. Locate A. Levingston, SQer, subpoena the trust ledger, and secure anything that smelled of paper and truth. I would not go to the courthouse. I am not a woman who learns new rooms easily, but I would gather the threads that make a net. I had money enough for bus fare and the small postage needed to send a registered letter. The rest I intended to obtain with the resourcefulness that had once steered me through a blackout while the neighbors panicked. I remembered, with a clarity both lovely and terrible, the night I had hidden my husband's last savings under the floorboard because hope sometimes wears a sock. Resourcefulness, I think, is the grandmother's true inheritance. The first thread I pulled was the name stamped at the bottom of the trust notice. A. Levingston. Esquire. I found his office by following the glare of brass placards and the kind of potted plants that live only under fluorescent lights. Mr. Levingston looked as if he were in the business of designing papers to make people forget what they were. He had a wife's laugh, polished, yes, but rehearsed, and a secretary who smiled like a thin curtain. I asked to see files. He said politely, "We only provide records to those with standing, Mrs. Rowe." Standing. What a curious thing to be asked for by the people who took it from you. I smiled and said, "Then you have it wrong." He took my name methodically and set about finding an excuse to close the door. So I became briefly what a grandmother is not supposed to be, a prowler with morals. I learned to listen at thresholds with the patience I had once used to hear a baby's breath. I waited by the law firm's entrance under the pretense of needing a stamp. When the secretary stepped out for tea at exactly 3:15 p.m., March 20th, the very day the codicil claimed to have been executed, I slipped inside the file room like a shadow. There were cabinets with labels, and among them a thin folder marked with my name. My heart did something shameful. It raced as if I still had the strength of a young woman running to catch a bus. Inside the folder was a photocopy of the codicil, and beneath it, a notation. Original signed and filed, March 20th, 2025. Levingston Files. The notation had a custodian's stamp. There was a time, 2:57 p.m. The secretary returned, humming a poem about tea, and I left with the photocopy tucked inside my knitting bag like contraband. I never meant to break the law, but I did intend to break the wall of certainty they had built. For days after, I sat with those papers and compared my hand to the signature. My handwriting had always been the sort that betrayed its age. The J in Jane curled like a question mark. The R in Roe a small, decisive mountain. The signature on the codicil had a tremor that mimicked my age, but lacked the certain habits of my hand. It was the work of a practiced imitator. I found Mr. Hargreaves's card folded inside a magazine. It had the neatness of a man who calls himself retired, but keeps a desk like an altar. I took the photocopies to him. He looked at me as people look at old oak, fond, but with eyes that knew the rings better than the bark. "This looks brittle with lies," he said, and for the first time since Miranda closed her mouth on our kitchen, I felt a small bloom of vindication. Micro cliffhanger. I found an email that made my blood run cold. It was a short message, forwarded to Mr. Hargreaves from an address at Levingston & Co. Subject, Codicil Confirmation. Please schedule notarization 3/20/2025, 2:30 p.m. Fee, $500. The email was clinical. The timestamp read 10:12 a.m., March 18th, 2025. I could breathe the air from that frail machine. An evidence trail is a rope thrown into dark water. I printed it, wrapped it around my hand like a bandage, and took it to a woman named Claire, who ran handwriting analysis for a hobby and who, in her former life, had been a teacher with a stern jaw and a love of puzzles. "This," she said, running a pencil like a wand over the letters, "is not the same hand." She pointed out the slant of the E, the abruptness of the capital M in Miranda when it appeared in other notes. She said the word forgery as if tasting something metallic. Dumas wrote, in a way that makes the heart sit up, that betrayal is the slow, elegant architecture of a ruin. At this stage of my story, I understood the phrase in my bones. Betrayal does not arrive like a thief in the night. It arrives with plans and receipts and polite notices. It has a ledger. It is patient. Armed with that paper and Claire's humble certificate, I took my case to someone I had hoped never to involve in my domestic storms, a retired county clerk named Mr. Bennett who kept his legal stamps like relics. He looked at the codicil and then at my original will. "Registers show no notarization on March 20th for Jane Roe," he said. However, the firm filed a motion for temporary custodianship on March 22nd, and the trust ledger shows a transfer of $5,000 to Levingston & Co. near consultation fee, listed as administrative services. I felt the tick of the knife again. There was a paper trail of small siphons, $5,000 here, a transfer of $3,000 to a maintenance account, an invoice for storage at $1,200. Greed is never so elegant as to take everything at once. It takes a hand at a time. On April 3rd, the day I had planned to board the ship, I received by registered mail an official Notice of Temporary Custodianship dated March 22nd. The document named Levingston & Comer as custodians and outlined authority to oversee maintenance of property, to inventory personal items, and to control access during a necessary review. It referenced the codicil. The words were precise and dull and had the effect of sealing a mouth with paper. I knew then that I had to act like someone who had nothing to lose, because under paper law, once the custodianship moves, your life's boundaries shift as if by tide. I hired a young legal assistant, Olivia, who owed me a favor because once I had mended her grandmother's coat. She was quick and liked words like lease pendants because they sounded like weapons. For a fee of $250, she filed a formal request to review original documents and asked for an accounting. The firm answered, in a manner that someone might use to swat a fly, "Requests will be processed in due course." The phrase due course, I learned, is the lawyer's lullaby. Micro cliffhanger. The man who handed me a coffee in the courthouse had a name that would alter everything. His name was Thomas Reed, a paralegal who kept his conscience in a folder marked miscellaneous. He told me, under the fluorescent flinches of the courthouse, that the original will had never been filed with Livingston & Co. "It was supposed to be filed March 2nd, he said, lowering his voice. But the courier misplaced it, and well, it showed up in an unmarked envelope a week later. His hands shook as he spoke. He had the look of someone who had picked up a pebble and found it was an egg. He gave me a detail, a lint smear on the envelope, the kind only an old quilt could leave. Blue thread. Blue thread. I remembered, with the prodigious oddity of memory, the blue thread from the hem of the dress I had sewn for Miranda when she was 8. Items leave traces, whether their owners wish it or not. Olivia and I began to unspool the firm's minute threads. We learned of an assistant, Maria, who tended to the files and had been known to take home documents to sort on late nights. We learned of a notary who, according to Mr. Bennett's register, had been absent on March 20th due to medical reasons, but whose name appeared inexplicably on a notarization stamp dated that day. The plot thickened like a good stew. The more we removed lids, the more the smell proved familiar. Not of rot, but of something cooked with care. Then the surprising thing happened. Maria, or someone in her orbit, made a mistake. She left a USB drive in the firm's copier with a folder named Client Temp. Olivia, who can be reckless when her back is against a wall, retrieved it. What was inside was the sort of thing that cheers and shatters a woman in one moment. Scanned copies of the original will, the codicil, email threads with Hargreaves, and, most damning, an audio file labeled March 20 Meeting MP3, micro cliffhanger. I listened to the file with my elbows on the table. The recording was grainy, as if someone had recorded in a hallway with their phone tucked into a dress. Voices, Miranda's high measured voice, Nicholas's low business timbre, Mr. Hargreaves's silky timbre, and a third voice, someone from Livingston & Co., officious and certain. "We must finalize the codicil for March 20th, Nicholas said according to the file. "Have the notary prepared. Make it seamless. Mother believes she is to sail. This is opportune." Miranda laughed lightly, like a curtain being drawn. "Make sure there are witnesses," she said. "2 is enough." Each word was a small winter. I felt the earth tilt beneath my chair. The file continued, voices arranging ink and stamps like conspirators in a kitchen. There was a phrase that froze my blood. "Once the temporary custodianship is in place, we can handle the transfer by April 15th. April 15th, tax day, the day when numbers are exposed to light. I marked the date in my head like a clock with an alarm, a Dumas-like aside, because even the humblest domestic ruin has its moral. In the ledger of human actions, instruments of betrayal are signed as easily as shopping lists. The only difference is the weight of the paper upon which they are recorded. I played the recording until my tea went cold. I transcribed it by candlelight, as if the ghosts in my kitchen might help me discern truth from choreographed speech. With the transcript and the PDF files, Olivia filed an emergency motion requesting a temporary injunction to halt transfers and demanding the originals be produced. We had in our hands a paper map of duplicity. Legal action is slow, I know. Its wheels grind like gears in a mill. But sometimes a single gear, seized by a small pebble of truth, can stop a whole machine. The court scheduled a hearing for April 10th at 10 a.m. We had time, if not much, but I did not want to wait for the court to unspool this story in legal slow motion. There are moments when the heart needs the swift justice of being seen. The museum gala was on April 5th. Miranda had arranged a speech to unveil a plaque honoring donors. It would be attended by the board, journalists, and people who knew Miranda as the architect of philanthropy. It would be a room full of witnesses to truth. I decided then that I would not only wait for the law, but also for the court of public regard. I would go to the gala and sit in the audience, and if I had to, I would stand and ask for words. The decision felt like a blade turning steady in the palm. I wrote a short note and slipped it into my handbag. Evidence of forgery. See counsel. It was the phrase of someone who had learned that small words can be catapults. Micro cliffhanger. I bought a dress that matched the blue thread. On the night of the gala, the museum smelled of perfume and aspiration. Crystal glasses chimed like small ocean bells. Miranda, in a dress that seemed sewn from light, stood under a lamp like a beacon. Her face when it found me in the crowd was a study in practiced surprise. She moved like a woman with a script. I moved like a grandmother with an envelope. I sat with the pearls cold in my pocket and the photocopies pressed to my ribs like armor. Nicknamed the benefactor's table, Miranda's table sat upon the raised dais. I sat 2 rows back with people who thought they knew what charity looked like. The speeches began, platitudes, names, applause. When Miranda took the stage at precisely 8:12 p.m., she spoke of giving, of legacy, and of family as continuity. The crowd drank the words like wine. I felt the anger, however, like a kettle beginning to whistle. I stood up. The room, civil and curious, turned a tide of heads. In my hand, I had notched a piece of paper, a printed excerpt from the audio file. My voice shook not with fear, but with the steady exhaustion of a woman who knows, finally, the price of silence. I walked to the dais as if toward a ritual. The microphones, trained on philanthropy, found me like a net. I said plainly, "My name is Jane Rowe. I am Miranda's mother." The lights on me were unfair. The microphones were hungry. I held up the paper and said, "There is evidence that the codicil dated March 20th is forged, that a temporary custodianship was arranged without my knowledge, and that funds were transferred unjustly. I have an audio recording and I demand the originals be produced." The room made a soft sound like a flock startled. Miranda's face, which had been a mask of porcelain, crumpled into something like a scolded child. Applause died. The band's music faltered. I had, in one breath, called for the law and for witnesses. The board chairman, a man who had made a career on reputations, looked as if someone had told him a confession about his own youth. Micro cliffhanger. Someone in the front row whispered, "Call security." The security men, practical as gateposts, moved toward me. Miranda hurried down the dais like a queen who hears the rustle of her skirts caught on a thorn. Her mouth opened and closed with the effort of a woman seeking her rehearsed line. But there was no rehearsed line for the sound of the courtroom in a woman's voice. The chairman stood and asked with thin patience, "Mrs. Rowe, might we continue this in private?" I laughed then. It came out like a cracked teacup. "Private?" I asked. "When have family matters ever improved in private?" I held up the transcript. "This house is full of witnesses. Let them hear the truth." Miranda's eyes flashed and she reached into her handbag. For an instant, I thought she might produce tears, and perhaps she did. Tears are a tool we all learn. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. My heart hammered as if the final act had begun, a Dumas-like aside, brief and high. When men arrange the theft of a life, they count hours like coin. They forget that truth keeps its own ledgers, and that time, unkind to falsehood, will write their names in the margins of shame. Her call went through. "Mother," she said into the receiver with a voice like a closed window, "sit down." The chairman, swayed by a mixture of social terror and protocol, insisted we adjourn. I turned to leave, and as I did, a hand, small, tremulous, and unexpectedly brave, pressed into mine. It was Thomas Reed. He had been the coffee man in the courthouse, and now he stood among the crowd, his face pale. "There are copies of the original will in my car," he said under his breath. I took them. I couldn't let them disappear. The room held its breath like a crowd before a confession. I felt, in that moment, not triumphant, not at all, but as if an old wound had finally been given air. I did not know then that my decision to stand would change everything that followed. I walked out into the night with Thomas and Olivia and a man with a conscience like a loose coin. The papers in my hands crinkled like leaves. The gala lights receded behind us like a memory. I knew as clearly as I had ever known anything that there was no turning back. I had moved from being watched to being the watcher. I had set the gear of the mill on edge. There would be consequences, legal, familial, maybe worse. I felt them press against my ribs like a storm, micro cliffhanger. As I stepped into the car, the phone in my bag vibrated with a single message: "Don't be foolish." The phone's vibration was a small drumbeat of warning. The message, "Don't be foolish," sat on the screen like a verdict. I wanted to say many things into that silence, but the truth was a small, simple compass. Foolish or not, I had moved. The night after the gala was filled with the small conspiracies of people who decide to be honest. Thomas Reed drove me home in a car that smelled faintly of old coffee and new courage. Olivia carried the photocopies and the USB like trophies. Thomas kept glancing at the papers in his lap, as if reading them by moonlight might change their content. We drove past the museum, where the lights had been dimmed after the scandal like a lighthouse that had lost its pride. I held the mason jar between my knees and felt its coins like small excuses for rage. The pearls were in my purse, and they seemed heavier than usual, as if they had taken on the gravity of their provenance. That first morning after, the house felt both conquering and fragile. When you break a window, the sound of rain seems to have new permission. Calls came in, some blunt like rocks, some soft like questions from neighbors. Mr. Hargreaves's voice on my answering machine was a polished thing. "Mrs. Rowe, for the sake of decorum and to avoid unnecessary distress, might we speak?" Miranda called too, but she left only the sound of breath. I answered neither. There is a dignity in silence that no legal paper can imitate. Olivia filed the emergency motion immediately. Motion for preservation of evidence and temporary restraining order, filed April 6, 2025, and the judge, perhaps sensing that paper could not supplant prayer, granted a short restraining order against any transfer pending the April 10th hearing. This small paper order felt like a plank placed across a flood. The trust company froze the accounts under the judge's directive. A ledger that had been wandering toward private pockets was halted. The bank's clerk, a young woman with the patient eyes of someone who wears wristwatches, told me the numbers out loud as if reading a rosary. Master trust balance, $230,000. Annuity earmarked, $50,000. Personal funds, $10,000. I repeated them like an incantation. Greed shrinks to numbers when you recite it. It becomes alarmingly clear. Micro cliffhanger. A subpoena arrived with the Morning Post. The subpoenas did what subpoenas were born to do. They made names travel on paper. Livingston and Kober were required to produce originals. Mr. Hargreaves was to appear. Maria, who had left the USB, was called to testify. For a day, I feared the firm might burn the paper trail like a hearth at midnight. Instead, they sent a message that sounded like a challenge. "We will comply in full." Compliance, as I had discovered, is sometimes the first gesture before deception shows its teeth. Behind the scenes, the firm whispered with the smoothness of men who believe law is cloth you can drape over shame. Miranda's calls increased. She switched from pleading to bargaining, offers that Chelsea cloth cannot hide. "We will ensure your comfort. We will—" and then silence, as if money could be a soft word to erase a name. I placed every offer in a drawer and shut it. I had learned, in war and raising children, that the price of dignity cannot be negotiated. Tomas, who had been the kind of man who handed out forms with a smile, became our quiet courier of truth. He had brought copies from his car because he could not bear the thought of originals disappearing into the smokescreen of a law office. "I saw Hargreaves the day after the gala," he said, with the kind of voice that carries small confessions. He looked like a man who smells of other people's work. His testimony was modest, but it had the directness of a neighbor who had been asked to do the smallest right thing. Maria, too, was a corner of the tale that came unspooled. She arrived at my little kitchen table with her hair pinned like a woman who hides her nerves. Her hands trembled and she said things that are the undoing of great plans. "They said I'd be rewarded for discretion," she whispered. I was given envelopes. I copied things. I signed a form I shouldn't have. She handed me a torn receipt with a blue thread caught in the fold. Blue thread. As if history were a seam that does not like to be cut. We arranged for Claire's handwriting report to be delivered to the court. It stated, plain and clinical, that the handwriting on the codicil did not match my handwriting, and that the signature bore marks of an imitation. Mr. Bennett provided the register records showing no notarization for March 20th, 2025, at the Levingston firm. The email timestamps were immutable, 10:12 a.m. March 18th, with a notation of a $500 fee, and the USB contained the grainy March 20 meeting.mp3 that even the judge would not be able to dismiss as a dream. Dumas taught that the law is a theater where men often play truth with masks. In our small opera, the masks were beginning to slip. Micro cliffhanger. They served me papers and a promise. The court date, April 10th at 10 a.m., arrived like a bell. Mornings are the good hours for justice, less perfumed by the illusions of afternoon. I put on my second-best coat. Mrs. Keene fitted me with a hat that felt like armor. Olivia bluntly pinched my arm and said, "This is a hearing, not a sermon. Let the law have its say." But I had a feeling that the law, however fair, often needs witnesses to give it the breath of public memory. The courtroom smelled of soaps and coffee and the neat terror of men who keep time with gavel taps. Judge Whitman sat like a lighthouse keeper who had seen too many ships crash into their own vanity. He wore a face that had studied likes and dislikes with equal unbelief. The gallery filled with a curious congregation, neighbors who wanted to see what their patroness would be like under the lamp of accusation. Reporters with notebooks like small hungry birds. Members from the museum's board whose faces looked as if their reputations had been put through a wringer. Miranda entered with a dress of cold silk and a face that bore the strain of a woman trying to fold herself into accommodation. Nicholas sat beside her with a smile that did not belong to anyone. Mr. Hargreaves took the stand with the soft confidence of a man who has smoothed many wrinkles in paper. Levingston's counsel arrived with neat files and the kind of smile one keeps for depositions. Olivia and I presented the evidence. Claire's handwriting analysis, Thomas's notarized statement that he had seen copies in his car on April 5th, Mr. Bennett's register showing no notarization on March 20th, the email timestamp showing a scheduled notarization on March 20th that never occurred, and the audio recording, the one that made Miranda's voice loop through the hardwood like a bell. The judge listened like a man reading the margins of a long book. Then Maria was called. She approached the stand like someone going to undo a curtain and found herself steadier in the light. Under oath, Maria said what my heart already suspected. The original will had been found, late, misdelivered, and then she claimed someone at the firm had been told to make arrangements. She admitted taking copies home. She admitted that she had been given envelopes with my name on them. When the prosecutor, a careful woman with the habit of saying less and meaning more, asked her about signatures and notarizations, Maria's voice broke and then steadied. "The notary stamp was applied later," she said. "I did not see the notary sign on March 20th. I was told to arrange it as if it were." The courtroom was the kind of place where small confessions made big walls crumble. Then the audio was played. Miranda's voice, captured in the corridor like a moth in amber, said the words that had been a knife. "Make sure there are witnesses. Once the temporary custodianship is in place, we can handle the transfer by April 15th. The judge's hand paused over his notes. A reporter in the back scribbled with a ferocity that suggested dinner for other mouths. Outside, somewhere, the museum lights flickered like guilty candles. Micro cliffhanger. Miranda's cheeks went pale as linen. When Mr. Hargreaves rose to speak, his argument was the exercise of a man who believed in smooth explanations, administrative error, miscommunication, the tragedy of misplaced paperwork. He suggested politely that people could mistake one's signature for another's. Age, stress, similar slant, he offered. For a moment, his words were like oil on water. They separated and did little to cover the stain. Then Thomas was allowed to speak, and his testimony had the domestic clarity that breaks great things. "I found the originals in my car," he said plainly. "I brought them to Mrs. Rowe that night because I could not stand the thought of them being taken." Olivia produced the USB. The court clerk verified its contents. The judge listened. It was not theatrics that did it. It was the accumulation of simple, undeniable things, timestamps, witnesses, receipts, that made the facade collapse like a pastry poorly baked. Judge Whitman ruled on the spot. The codicil, dated March 20th, 2025, was ordered struck from the record pending a full investigation. The temporary custodianship was lifted. Livingston and Co. were ordered to account for all transfers from the trust since March 15th, 2025, and to freeze any disbursements. He also requested that the local district attorney review the evidence for possible fraud. It was a small victory and a large one, a swing of the gavel that felt like a bell tolling for better things. Dumas-like aside before the final confrontation. In the ledger of men's deeds, there are entries that time insists upon auditing. No hand is so firm that it can write on the soul and expect no counter-entry. Justice, though slow, is not blind. She merely squints until she recognizes the truth. Micro cliffhanger. A reporter asked Miranda for a comment. Miranda, whose life had been measured in galleries and donor boxes, found the public moment a harsher stage than she had ever known. The museum board convened the next day and, in a scene that pleasures small hearts, announced an independent review of donations and a temporary removal of Miranda's name from the donor plaque until the investigation's conclusion. Headlines ran like hungry fish. Philanthropy questioned. Family feud reveals legal storm. Grandmother's fight exposes trust. Social media, that cold amphitheater, found its voice and made of the tale a press, a relentless press. People who had applauded Miranda's public face now whispered about her private handiwork. Nicholas, who had been adept at making legal problems look like simple inconveniences, found his own board noticing irregularities. His firm, hearing the words accounting irregularities and ethics investigation, began the slow, polite process of distancing. Men who trade in reputations learn the art of disappearing when the wind blows wrong. I did not relish watching them stumble. I felt only the fierce sweetness of someone reclaimed. The pearls weighed as a crown should. I had not expected how small acts of kindness would be my reward after the storm. People I had once thought had simply drifted away returned. Not for my scandal, but for my person. Mrs. Keene brought bread. The neighbor who had once forgot my birthday baked a pie and sat with me at my table. The children from the street came by, and I filled their small hands from the mason jar. The jar that had once contained the funds for my cruise became, miraculously, a treasury of something else. Coins for children's pocketed dreams, the small joy of a child buying an ice cream. I gave away the chipped mug to Mrs. Keene. When she wrapped it and thanked me, the mug felt like a vessel that had held more than tea. I kept the pearls on my dresser and touched them each morning, the weight of them a reminder that dignity sits heavy and precious. Micro cliffhanger. On April 15th, a transfer was attempted. They had tried, as the audio predicted, to move funds on April 15th. The bank had frozen the account, and an alert went out. An attempted disbursement of $7,200 to an account listed under maintenance contractors. The move was stopped, and the bank officers looked at the wires like doctors finding a misdiagnosed patient. The court's temporary restraints and the judge's order had done more than halt money. They had interrupted a plan. The district attorney's office, spurred by Judge Whitman's referral, opened an inquiry into potential criminal conduct, forgery and wire fraud among the possible charges. The air smelled just slightly of consequence. Miranda came to my door the day the museum announced her removal from the plaque. She stood there with the face of someone who had been stripped of public robes. Her voice was raw. "Ma," she said, "I can fix this." I looked at her as I'd looked at her when she was 5 and had scraped her knee and come for a bandage expecting miracles. "Can you?" I asked. She stumbled. I could tell by the tremor of her fingers that she did not know how to be small. "There were things, miscommunications," she began. Her eyes flicked to the pearls in the little velvet box on my dresser. Then she looked away. She was, for the first time, a figure I did not entirely recognize. The glamour had peeled, and a raw thing sat beneath, some mixture of panic and regret. There is a peculiar satisfaction in justice that is not vengeful, but rather restorative. The law that returned my will to its groove did more than correct a paper. It repaired a voice. The judge ordered reparation. Livingston and Cupper were responsible for an accounting, and for ensuring that any improper transfers were returned pending determination. They would likely face civil suits, and the DA's office could file charges depending on the outcome. For anyone who enjoys the theater of downfall, there is a certain glee in seeing men of paper have to account for their ink. Micro cliffhanger. She handed me a letter with shaking fingers. Miranda did not fight the court's decision publicly. Instead, she wrote a letter that arrived under the kitchen door like an embarrassed confession. She apologized, not for her silence, but for the choices that led to it. She wrote of fear and of wanting security. She wrote in a smaller voice than the one used for gala speeches that she had been wrong. The letter was a curious thing. In it, she asked to come and see me, not as her mother dressed in the robes of memory, but as the woman who had fed her soup when she was sick. I read the letter twice and then 3 times, and each time I felt the old, complicated tenderness flare. Love does not extinguish itself in the face of error. It seeks a new arrangement. The museum, which had been a stage for Miranda's public identity, held a press conference where the board read a statement about governance and transparency. Words that sound like a prayer to the bank. Donors withdrew some pledges. The plaque was removed and placed in storage until the investigation concluded. The plaque, which had once glittered with her name, now sat in a cardboard box like a thing returned. It struck me absurdly that material honor is brittle. It crackles when exposed to daylight. Miranda's social friends, those whose smiles had been rivers of convenience, began to thin. Shame is a social solvent. I returned to the kitchen and poured tea into the chipped mug I had given away. It tasted like victory and like regret. The mason jar, now a different kind of vessel, sat on the table, full of coins and the small notes of children's hopes. I had not gone on my cruise, but I had cleared a path I had not known needed clearing. Justice had been slow but precise. Dignity had not been purchased, and yet it had been restored by legal work and the stubborn, sometimes ugly courage of neighbors. Micro cliffhanger. In a drawer, I found one final paper. The last paper was small and ordinary, an old receipt from the bakery where I had first worked, dated June 12, 1968. It reminded me that lives are built of tiny transactions and small acts of love. But also, beneath the receipt, tucked away like a late thought, was the original letter I had written, the will as I had intended it. Miranda had come to my house, sat at my table, and together we read it aloud. She wept in a way that had nothing to do with performance, the sound of a woman finally hearing her choices reflected back by the small, unadorned truth. "Ma," she said, "I was afraid of not having anything of my own. I thought if I controlled everything, I would feel safe." I put my hand on hers, and for the first time in months, her fingers did not flinch away. What followed was not the thunderclap of melodrama, but the gentle, slow return of things to a reasonable order. The district attorney pursued the inquiry. Livingston and Cupper reached a settlement to return improperly transferred funds and agreed to an independent audit. Mr. Hargreaves resigned his informal advisory role, a small concession that some men make to keep larger reputations intact. Miranda stepped down from certain boards and began awkwardly to attempt restitution. The plaque at the museum remained in storage, but the board agreed to a new policy on donors and oversight that read like a small victory for truth. I regained the annuity, $50,000, to ensure maintenance and warmth for the house, and the personal funds of $10,000 were restored to me. The bank sent a letter detailing the recovered sums and the reversal of the attempted transfers. Greed, in the end, had miscounted not only its victims but its endurance. In a small ceremony that involved tea and the neighbors I had been surprised to find standing by my gate, I took out the pearls. I could have given them back to Miranda, as my original letter suggested, but dignity is an inheritance that need not always be passed down. I placed them around my neck, and they lay against my throat like a small halo. They were not a token of fortune, but of memory and regained agency. Dumas-like moral aside, final. When a family lists its treasures, it often forgets to count the human things: trust, respect, dignity. The ledger of life is not balanced by money alone. Truth, once allowed to breathe, reclaims what was unjustly taken. In the years since, people have asked me if I am glad I stood in public and called for the truth. I am glad not because I desired spectacle, but because I remembered what it is to be a woman who raised another soul and who deserved, at the very least, courtesy in her twilight. Miranda and I rebuilt an uneasy bridge. Some planks were replaced by time, others by awkward apologies and small kindnesses. She volunteered at the community garden, where I taught her to plant beans when she was a child. She sat with the children I gave coins to from the mason jar and told them, clumsily, about generosity. We never returned to the old ease. Betrayal leaves a scar that no surgeon can stitch invisibly. But that scar carries its own lesson. It is a map for future travelers. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today. If you see an elder being pushed aside in favor of convenience, remember that voices are small things, but they can make noise together. Subscribe, if you will, because an old woman by her hearth has more confessions to make and more small rebellions to tell. Comment below with a story of your own, or, better yet, call someone you love and say a true thing to them. Truth, like the sea I once meant to see, is patient and wide, and it will come for you when you call it.